Welcome to MUS 231's Class 1 Recap. This course is entitled Recording Technology 1. I'm your instructor, Vince Casas. If you have any questions, you can email me at james.casas@unlv.edu. Rules for the studio are available on your syllabus. This week, our topics in the studio include purpose and function, different types of studios, studio roles, and some basic studio design and layout. So let's begin with the purpose and function of your basic studio. Recording studios were created with the purpose of generating media that could be reproduced. One of the major goals of being in the studio is to gain more control of the actual sources that are being recorded. Then, by being in a very controlled atmosphere, we can fine-tune the final product before it's reproduced. There are many different types of recording studios, but most of them fall into some basic form of the following categories. So let's start with music production studios. These types of studios handle most of your recorded media in the form of song. All of your favorite musical artists have been recorded in a music production studio. And while a music production studio is one of the most common studios, it doesn't generate the most revenue. And that leads us to post-production studios. A post-production recording studio focuses on media for film, TV, or even game. The real difference in a post-production studio is that post-production is the assembling of all of the final media that goes into a sync for TV or film. While the musical score, sound effects, and Foley work are typically done at different studios, a post-production facility will record dialogue for most projects. One of those studios is called the scoring stage. All visual media for film, TV, and game is usually accompanied by some form of underscore or movement of music, thus creating the need for a recording studio designed for composition and the recording of a large ensemble. The monitoring and playback aspects for video and audio are much more complex than in most studios. In addition, a scoring stage typically requires more microphones and more track count when recording. Once the score recording is complete, it can be sent off to be mixed at any number of recording studios, and once it's finalized, it'll be sent off for post-production. One more huge aspect in post-production is the Foley Stage. The Foley Stage is a very unique recording studio component, and it's designed specifically to create sounds that are very natural to the actual aspects of what you see in a visual medium. Footsteps, rain, car noises, general ambience, and very prime sound effects are usually generated on a Foley Stage. Once a Foley catalog is created and generated, it will then be sent off to post-production for final sync. A mix studio is a studio that focuses only on mixing the final product. Mix studios do not require ISO booths or the tracking rooms, so they focus on the control room where most of the mix is taking place. Since a mix studio can focus on the mixing aspect alone, they often steer their budget towards high-end mixing equipment. A mastering studio, much like a mix studio, is also focused on one element: mastering. Mastering is the final process of taking the final stereo stems and making the most out of them for final production. A mastering studio requires different equipment than a mix studio, and it focuses primarily on mastering a 2-track or maybe even a 5.1. Because mastering is a more pristine and final stage of the audio process, most of the equipment required for mastering is much more expensive than mix equipment. Finally, let's take a look at project studios. A project studio is typically a smaller studio, and it may be actually home-based in someone's residence. Project studios typically handle a wide range of pre-production purposes. Many artists, songwriters, and composers utilize a project studio to minimize costs. Most project studios do a lot of in-the-box recording. Once pre-production or project files are completed at a project studio, they're normally sent off to a larger studio for completion, mixdown, and mastering. Live multitrack recording is an element that we must talk about. Many artists and productions utilize a multitrack recording in a live performance. Oftentimes, this live multitrack will then be sent to a recording studio to be finalized, mixed, and mastered. Now let's take a look at some basic roles in the studio. Let's first start with the studio manager. The The studio manager is responsible for all day-to-day activities and all personnel at any recording studio. They handle all studio scheduling, and they coordinate between record labels, A&R, producers, and engineers. The engineer is responsible for all aspects of recording, editing, mixdown, and possibly mastering in a facility. While the engineer is not directly responsible for the entire facility, the engineer is considered the fighter pilot in the organization. A lot of times, the engineer may actually generate the most income. Now, producers are a bit of a different breed, and sometimes they can be cross-mixed as engineers. The producer's main goal is to keep the record label happy by creating a product that's very sellable while still meeting the needs and the tastes of the actual artist. Producers don't directly work for the recording studio, but they work with and are typically hired by either the A&R rep, the artist, or the record label to work in conjunction with the project. Because producers have a musical say and a musical investment in most works, the producer also typically generates more money based upon additional royalties. The studio editor is more of a worker bee that typically focuses on microscopic elements of the project itself. It could be the timing or tuning of guitar or vocals. If the editor works in post-production, they may focus on spotting notes or syncing specific cues to film, TV, or game. The studio tech is an integral part of any recording facility and is often an overlooked role. The tech's main job is to focus on keeping the facility running on a day-to-day basis. General repairs and maintenance are conducted by the studio technician. And though there are times that the studio tech may actually sit in on a recording session, they're typically not a part of the production phase. The assistant engineer is typically an entry-level position, but it requires some abilities to be able to recall and organize information in a studio session. The assistant engineer reports directly to the engineer on any given project. They are responsible for taking detailed notes of any recording session, which includes mic placement, mic choice, and recalling any settings on outboard gear or any external information. In some facilities, the assistant engineer may actually be the face of the company and handle clients directly, while at some facilities, the assistant engineer is only responsible for note-taking and recall. Most larger recording facilities have a receptionist that's responsible for the day-to-day traffic and any volume of calls that may be sent into the recording studio. And finally, there's the recording intern. Typically, the recording intern is given a mundane list of tasks, which may include sweeping floors, setting up or organizing mics and mic cable, and the occasional coffee run. Now, there are a couple different types of engineers. The first one is the mix engineer. Mix engineers focus on primarily one thing, mixing audio. I often compare them to a line cook. Typically in a line cook setting, they're given one task and one role, and their big task is mixing. But it is important to note that mix engineers often get paid a lot of money. The tracking engineer is usually focused on the primary elements of the recording itself. Their whole goal is to get the best, most pristine recording they possibly can deliver. A tracking engineer typically works with the producer to make sure that the artist is getting the most out of their recordings. And finally, the mastering engineer is responsible for mastering all final audio. Mastering engineers typically work in a mastering studio that's focused on only the mastering process. So let's talk about some basic studio layout. First, we have the control room. The control room is where the operator or engineer sits and conducts all of the operations for recording. The control room typically harbors all of the gear that's responsible for tracking and mixing. The live room is where the actual recording happens. The live room is typically large enough to accommodate several musicians at one time. And live rooms are usually geared to create a specific sound acoustically when combined with musical instruments. The live room has a more open, spacious sound and is ideal for recording drums and ensembles. The ISO booth is a much smaller recording room that focuses on things like dialogue, vocals, or guitar. The isolation booth has a more controlled sound and is usually typically used to create drier elements for the mix. The machine tape room is the brain of the facility. For several reasons, we have a separate room just designed for the computer systems and any tape machines. The main two reasons for separating these items is one, to create a climate-controlled area that's best for the equipment, and two, to limit noise in the studio. All studio facilities that actually generate recordings have a mic closet or a mic locker area that they keep their mics and cables. Now let's look at some of the basic studio design. Most recording facilities have something called floating floors. In a floating floor design, the concept is to create a second floor on top of the original floor. This floor is then disconnected from any adjoining rooms so that sound is not transmitted through the floor. Studios also have something called a sound lock. Sound locks are typically small room chambers that separate one room from another by creating a smaller room in between. The purpose of the sound lock is to limit the amount of bleed from one room to another. And by eliminating this bleed, we generate a more quality picture of what we're listening to and monitoring while we're recording. In addition to having a sound lock, we also often double the walls in a studio recording facility. An additional wall typically creates a limited amount of transmission through the walls themselves. In between these double walls, we'll add absorption, and the absorption material will limit the amount of transmission from room to room. When designing our studio facility, we limit the amount of parallel walls. Parallel walls create something known as a standing wave. By eliminating parallel walls, we redirect the reflections of sound so that they don't collide into each other to generate these standing waves. High-angled ceilings are very popular in the recording studio. The height and the distance of the ceiling from the floor generally creates some sort of space or atmosphere for the studio, while the angle of the ceiling redirects reflections so that they are not directly reflected back down to the floor. We also limit the amount of 90-degree corners. 90-degree corners in a recording facility typically generate flutter or comb filtering, which has negative impacts on the quality of sound recording. You'll also find diffuser panels in most recording facilities. The concept of diffusion is to allow for frequencies to be reflected, but instead of just allowing them to be reflected at 100%, they are redirected and distributed in the most even fashion throughout the room. Bass traps are common in the recording studio and most often seen at the ceiling of the control room. A bass trap is typically a large cabinet that's hung in the room and allows bass frequencies to enter the cabinet, but only allows a certain percentage of those frequencies to escape. Thanks for watching. You've learned a lot from today's lesson. Stay tuned for more and feel free to follow me at vincecasas.com.